In Chapter 1, October 1909, Professor Wilde arrives in the remote village of Hrafnsvik, to begin her study of the Hidden Ones, an enigmatic fairy species. Accompanied by her aging dog, Shadow, she disembarks from a freighter and drags her trunk to a rented, turf-roofed cottage on a mountain slope. Despite her enthusiasm, the isolation, chill, and snow prompt doubts about the hardships ahead. She meets the gruff farmer Christian Egilson, who warns her against provoking certain fairy types and provides basic supplies. Wilde resolves to face the challenges and begin her pioneering research. In Chapter 2, Wilde settles into the cottage in Hrafnsvik and meets Finn Christiansen, Christian's son, who brings firewood and helps with basic amenities. Finn discusses his father's expectations and offers his help, but Wilde is uneasy about his lack of social finesse. Wilde reflects on the research she will conduct about the Hidden Ones, the fairies of Liosland, emphasizing the importance of stories in understanding the folk. A letter from her colleague, Wendell Bambleby, arrives, warning her of the dangers of her fieldwork but also seeking her findings. Wilde grows more determined, setting aside the letter and preparing for her work. In Chapter 3, Wilde begins her day in the cottage with breakfast prepared by Finn and discusses her plans to study the local fairies, particularly the Hidden Ones. She explains her research methodology and her classification of fairies into courtly and common types. Finn mentions his mother's role as a Godi, and they discuss local traditions. Wilde then sets out into the Karderskoger forest, observing the environment and documenting findings. After encountering a possible fairy presence near a hot spring, she leaves an offering and sings a song in the fairy language, continuing her preparations to study the folk. In Chapter 4, Wilde embarks on a hike through the fells, documenting the landscape and its possible connections to the Fae. She theorizes about the common Fae of Liosland and compares them to other northern folk. Afterward, she visits the village tavern, where she meets the villagers, including Lilia, who has a fairy portal on her property. Wilde also encounters Aud, the village headwoman, and Thora, an elderly woman who speaks candidly about the locals' views on Wilde. The night takes a darker turn when Wilde meets Otter, a woman visibly affected by a fairy encounter, leaving her disturbed. In Chapter 5, Wilde wakes up to a cold morning and a disappointing breakfast prepared by Finn's father, which includes burnt bread and a seaweed relish. Finn informs her that the issue lies with Aud, the village headwoman, who is upset due to Wilde's research potentially exposing the affliction of her niece Outer. Wilde is frustrated by this misunderstanding, as her intention was never to offend. She recognizes the importance of gaining the villagers' trust for her research and plans to meet Aud at the tavern to explain herself and mend the situation. In Chapter 6, Wilde sets out to explore the terrain using a detailed map and discovers the sulfuric spring. She finds that her offering has been taken, signaling the presence of a fairy. A small skeletal fairy appears, and after a brief interaction, they strike a bargain. Wilde offers a beaver skin in exchange for the fairy's cooperation, although the fairy is unwilling to reveal much about himself. He agrees to bring her bread, and after Wilde provides an offering of Turkish delights, the fairy vanishes. Wilde continues her research, pleased with the progress made. In Chapter 7, worsening weather confines Emily Wilde indoors, and she discovers abandoned fairy offerings by a glacier. A chance encounter at a village shop reveals the ominous presence of a fairy in a nearby farmhouse, a detail Emily notes for later investigation. Meanwhile, she continues bartering with the fairy she met previously, exchanging a beaver skin for bread and agreeing to clear a snowy path in return for ongoing provisions. Amid mounting challenges, poor meals, bad weather, and damaged supplies, she perseveres in her research and fieldwork, determined to document the Hidden Ones despite growing complications. In Chapter 8, Emily prepares to dive into her research, but Bambleby's late start and relaxed approach cause delays. Finn delivers breakfast and reveals that coffee is rare in the village. Bambleby, after a long, elaborate meal, dismisses structured plans, preferring flexible fieldwork. Emily outlines her methodical approach, mapping the area, revisiting fairy sites, and gathering ethnographic interviews. Bambleby suggests splitting tasks. Emily investigates a suspected brownie-occupied house and the afflicted Otter Hildsdottir, while he plans to speak with the headwoman. Despite tensions, Bambleby assures her she will lead the resulting paper, then promptly sets off, leaving Emily to begin her work. In Chapter 9, Emily investigates a changeling in a village farmhouse, discovering it's a courtly fae. She interviews the creature, who admits to causing suffering for its foster parents. Emily also learns it wants to return to its fairy family. She notes that the changeling's behavior diverges from the norm for such fae, raising questions. She returns to the forest to find Bambleby napping, and confronts him about interfering with her research and upsetting the brownie she's been befriending. Despite his dismissal, she presses him to help Mord and Aslog, whose son was taken by the changeling. Bambleby agrees to visit them the next day. In Chapter 10, Bambleby convinces Emily to join him and their assistants for a night at the tavern. While Bambleby entertains the villagers, Emily enjoys a quiet evening with a book. Later, Bambleby visits the changeling, discovering it knows little about its parents. When Emily learns that Bambleby took the assistants to the changeling's farmstead, she is frustrated, fearing they're unprepared. Bambleby points out that Emily's lack of research into the villagers' customs caused her conflict with Aud, and advises her to seek Aud's kindness. Emily feels overwhelmed, but agrees to a walk with Bambleby to clear her mind. In Chapter 11, Emily and Bambleby explore a lake, but find little evidence of the Nyker. Returning to the cottage, Emily discovers that their students have mysteriously disappeared, rumored to be sailing to Loa Bear. Finn reveals he overheard them planning to board a ship to London. As snow continues to fall, Emily attempts to gather firewood but injures Bambleby with an axe. While tending to his wound, Emily seeks Aud's help, and together they manage to stabilize Bambleby. Later, Aud hints at something more, and Emily reflects on her emotional struggle, deciding to visit Poe at the spring. In Chapter 12, Emily reflects on how their time in Hrafnsvik has changed after Wendell's injury. The villagers, particularly Aud, now offer help and food, and Emily learns more about the local fae. The common fae of Lyoslund are unpredictable, often involved in bargains and offerings, but they do not dwell in households. The courtly fae, however, are elusive and dangerous, often taking youth in love for their dances, leaving victims hollow. Emily discovers that in recent years, several youths have been taken, suggesting the courtly fae are increasingly drawn to Hrafnsvik. She records their stories for future study. Interlude. The story of the woodcutter and his cat is a folk tale about a woodcutter who, after losing his hand to frostbite, seeks help from a fairy tree. The fairies give him a white cat, which he grows to despise due to its strange behavior and the trouble it causes in his life. Despite mistreating the cat, it protects him from various misfortunes. Eventually, the woodcutter kills the cat, and in return, he tries to destroy the fairy tree but is drawn to the Tall One's fae. The cat reveals it had protected him all along, but after its death, the woodcutter vanishes. A whaler, protected by fairies in exchange for allowing them to inhabit his house during the new moon, betrays his bargain by fleeing from wolves. When the fairies leave, he is forced to deliver whale bones to them each month. The fairies hang the bones on a white tree, which groans and leans, indicating the imprisonment of a mad fairy king. Desperate, the whaler marries an elderly fairy for help. Together, they bury the bones of the dead under the tree, breaking the fairy's control. The whaler marries his fairy bride, lives happily, and dies wealthy. A beautiful orphan girl, believed to have fairy ancestry, falls in love with a carpenter who fears her due to her heritage. The girl meets a bodiless fairy who leads her to a white fairy tree, suggesting it could provide a dowry. Despite knowing the consequences, she chops the tree down but is driven mad when its leaves touch her. She kills the carpenter when he tries to stop her, and the villagers pursue her. They eventually find and kill her. The white tree is believed to be the same as in the whaler's tale, and the girl's story haunts Hrafnsvik. In Chapter 13, Emily gathers supplies for a journey to find the white tree, anticipating a 3-hour hike each way. Afterwards, she notices Mord, bruised, and learns from Grow that he had been rescuing his wife from near drowning. Emily shares this with Bambleby, who dismisses the situation, suggesting Mord and Aslog should kill the changeling to end their suffering. Bambleby advises Emily to tell the couple to be kind to the changeling, likening it to her treatment of Poe. Emily is taken aback, but Bambleby claims this approach is what the clever parents of stolen children in Ireland do to appease the folk. In Chapter 14, Emily and Bambleby find the mysterious white tree described in folklore. Despite Bambleby's reluctance, Emily insists on documenting the tree, though she experiences a strange urge to touch it. After Bambleby uses some fairy magic to distract her, The roots of the tree ensnare him, and Shannon realizes the tree's king, an exiled fairy, seeks to possess him. Bambleby, revealing he is a fairy prince, manages to escape. On the return journey, Bambleby falls ill, likely due to his fairy nature, and Emily, after helping him recover, amusingly observes his condition as Thora's granddaughter arrives for a rendezvous. In Chapter 15, Emily and Bambleby face the harsh weather and prepare for their research. Aud gives Emily candles to ward off the tall ones, and shares a bizarre recipe. While Bambleby mocks the candles, he later agrees to assist in interviewing Otter's family, learning that her daughter, taken by the Hidden Ones, has returned mute and unwell. Emily spends the day working, while Bambleby flirts with Lilia. Later, Emily presses Bambleby about his past, revealing his exile and ambitions to overthrow his stepmother. Despite their banter, Emily realizes she may help him find a way back to his fairy realm. In Chapter 16, Emily experiences unsettling symptoms of a fairy enchantment and resolves to keep her condition hidden. After discovering Poe's burned tree, she learns the Tall Ones have taken Lilia and her partner Margaret. Although Bambleby suggests feigning an investigation, Emily insists on a genuine search, driven by both scholarly curiosity and a sense of responsibility. Reluctantly, Bambleby agrees to help. In Chapter 17, Emily and Bambleby prepare for their journey to find Lilia and Margaret, with the village providing provisions. They follow the tracks into the wilderness, encountering a fairy tree healed by Bambleby's magic. Poe answers Emily questions about the Tall Ones, revealing their fear of fire. As they journey, Bambleby uses his magic to create a vibrant living display in the snow, but Emily grows increasingly unsettled by his power. In the wilderness, Emily is nearly attacked by Bogles, but is saved by Bambleby, who unleashes a violent, terrifying fury on the fairies. The chapter ends with Emily confronting her feelings about Bambleby's fairy nature. In Chapter 18, Emily sets out alone with Shadow to find a way into the fairy realm, leaving Wendell behind for his safety. After a long journey, they enter the realm and discover a winter fair, where Emily observes the folk and locates Lilia and Margaret. She uses Shadow's magic to muffle their enchantment and brings them to safety. They are approached by a fairy lord, who demands Emily cloak in exchange for her safety. After a tense negotiation, Emily receives a new cloak. As they attempt to leave, they become lost in the fairy world, relying on a magical compass to find their way out. In Chapter 19, Wendell recounts the aftermath of rescuing Emily from the fairy realm. He describes his frustration with the harsh environment and his decision to follow her tracks after she disappeared. He finds her in a cave, healing Margaret, and uncovers Shadow's true nature as a black hound. After a confrontation with a fairy, Wendell uses his magic to reverse time and catch an arrow. The fairy challenges him to a fight, and with Emily's help, they defeat him. The chapter ends with Wendell, Emily, and their companions heading back, with Emily's head resting on his shoulder as they travel. In Chapter 20, Emily reflects on Wendell's account of their journey and his insights into fairy magic. She recovers from the enchantment she experienced while making the sword, and Wendell helps her heal Margaret. After their return to the cottage, Wendell is praised by the villagers, but Shannon grows concerned about the implications of his fairy origins. The pair work on their paper, with Wendell teasing Emily about her competence with the folk. He mentions seeking a door back to his realm and hints at finding it, leaving Emily puzzled. She continues her research while Wendell goes for a walk. In Chapter 21, Emily reflects on Wendell's secretive quest for his door and his work on their paper. Lilia and Margaret visit, offering Emily a lesson in chopping wood, which she accepts with gratitude. The women's conversation reveals their discomfort with Wendell, and Emily clarifies her lack of romantic involvement with him. The topic shifts to Emily's past relationships, and Margaret teases her about being choosy. Lilia invites Emily for another lesson, and Emily realizes how much she enjoyed both the task and their company. The chapter ends with the women leaving Emily feeling content despite her ongoing research. In Chapter 22, Emily revisits fairy lore to solve the mystery of Hrafnsvik's heightened vulnerability to the Hidden Ones. Aud's visit prompts a realization. The village's proximity to a changeling, an especially powerful fairy child, is what draws the courtly fae. Emily explains that the changeling's magic acts as a lantern, attracting the Hidden Ones, even without direct ties to him. Aud and Thora reluctantly acknowledge the danger, but finding the changeling's true name is the only known way to banish him. Emily urges patience while she considers a solution, aware that the village's children remain at risk. In Chapter 23, Emily and Wendell return to the cottage after their journey, where Emily confronts Wendell about obtaining the changeling's true name. Despite Wendell's reluctance, they eventually use a doll as leverage, and the changeling reveals his name, Adlinduri. They take him back to his mother, a fairy woman cursed by her former king's betrayal. Upon their return, Aslog and Mord react to the changeling's return with disbelief and sorrow. Later, Wendell makes an unexpected proposal, suggesting that Emily join him in ruling his kingdom. Emily is conflicted, but begins to contemplate the possibility. In Chapter 24, Emily struggles with the enchantment compelling her to return to the Fairy King. Despite recognizing the spell, she is unable to stop herself from dressing and leaving the cottage. As she walks, she tries to manipulate the enchantment by imagining wolves, eventually retrieving an axe and attempting to sever her enchanted finger. She succeeds, experiencing both relief and intense pain. After bandaging her hand, she sets off toward the white tree, determined to confront the source of the enchantment, but now bearing the physical toll of her defiance. In Chapter 25, Emily reflects on her motivations for freeing the Fairy King. She breaks free of the enchantment and, after a visit to Poe, learns how the king was trapped in the tree by a cloak woven from all seasons. She travels to the tree, where she creates a snowman using the king's magic. Upon freeing the king, he slowly transforms from ice to a mortal form. Despite his insistence on marrying her, Emily resists, stating she already has a betrothed. The king creates a magnificent ice castle, preparing for his return to power. In Chapter 26, Emily accompanies the Hidden King to his newly summoned ice castle. She expresses concern over the avalanche caused by the castle, but the king shows little remorse, offering a feast instead. The king reflects on his past, explaining his immortality and how he plans to release mortals held by the folk, including those kidnapped by his people. Emily, though terrified, is intrigued by his promise. Upon arrival at the palace, she experiences a sense of disorientation and is placed in a grand chamber overlooking a vast, cold landscape. Her memory of the events becomes hazy. In Chapter 27, Emily remains trapped in the Hidden King's palace, surrounded by enchantments. She attempts to escape, but each effort is thwarted by the magic, which brings her back to her chamber or places her in a hot spring bath. Despite her frustration, she continues to hold on to her coin and journal. The king insists on preparing for their wedding, sending craftsmen to attend to her every need. Emily, growing more impatient, sarcastically directs a fairy chef to serve an absurd meal. She also refuses to cooperate with dressmakers, signaling her resistance to the situation. In Chapter 28, Emily learns the Hidden King's castle has caused devastating snowfall, burying mortal villages. While the king dismisses the impact on humans, promising only a temporary winter, Emily fears it could last far longer. The king brushes off her concerns, even reminiscing about mortal traditions. Meanwhile, fairies seeking the king's favor bring disturbing gifts, including severed heads, which the king decorates and displays. Though he claims a love for forgiveness, his former queen is reportedly killed by his wolves. Despite his tears, the king rewards her killers, leaving Emily increasingly uneasy about her surroundings. In Chapter 29, Emily continues trying to find reasons to avoid marrying the Hidden King, citing her lack of knowledge and skills, but he dismisses her concerns, indifferent to her shortcomings. He explains that she will live briefly in his world before he marries someone of his own stature. As the wedding approaches, the palace is filled with preparations, laughter, and music, while Emily grows desperate. She plans to find a way to reverse the king's actions and the endless winter he's brought, but fears she is losing herself as time passes in the fairy realm. In Chapter 30, Emily devises a plan to escape by manipulating the fairy tailor who is working on her wedding preparations. She requests a veil made from the fur of a hare she supposedly hunted, hoping the tailor might take her to the forest. However, the tailor, a disguised Wendell, reveals his identity and explains the plan to rescue her. He shares how Aud and the villagers are involved in a plot to poison the Hidden King during the wedding celebration. Wendell, disguised as a common fae, reassures Emily, and they prepare for the impending rescue. In Chapter 31, Emily reads Wendell's journal, uncovering the villagers' continued efforts to rescue her. After discovering her note, Wendell and the villagers made multiple attempts to summon the Hidden King and gain access to his court, ranging from ritual offerings to intricate schemes inspired by fairy lore. Despite setbacks, they pressed on, showing a dedication that deeply affects Emily. For the first time in her life, she feels supported and realizes she is not alone in her predicament. In chapter 32, the wedding ceremony at the king's palace unfolds amid tension and unease. Emily, seated beside the king, watches as a series of gifts are presented, including a pair of shoes from Wendell that offer a moment of warmth. As the plot to kill the king with poisoned wine unfolds, Emily hesitates and stops the plan at the last moment, realizing its wrongness. In the chaos that follows, Aude covers for her, and Wendell leads Emily and the villagers on a daring escape. They navigate the palace's enchantments, with Wendell's intervention allowing them to finally escape into the valley. In chapter 33, Emily and Wendell prepare to leave Liosland for London. After recovering from the enchantments, Emily recalls the events of their escape, with Wendell guiding her out of the fairy realm. The villagers, having helped her, bid her farewell with gifts and heartfelt goodbyes. Aude successfully requests the king end the endless winter, and Emily reflects on the bond with the villagers and her changing feelings toward Wendell. As they board a ship for Loaber, Emily struggles with her emotions and the complexities of her relationship with Wendell while pondering the future and her next steps. In chapter 34, Emily and Wendell present their findings at a scholarly conference. While they miss the plenary session, Wendell participates in multiple panels, securing Emily a spot on one as well. As the day of their presentation arrives, the two prepare to reveal their artifacts from Faerie: a melted cloak, a necklace of ice, and a volcanic rock with a vanishing door. Emily remains apprehensive, but Wendell, now fully restored to his previous form, appears self-assured and excited. They take the stage together, ready to share their extraordinary discoveries with the skeptical academic audience. In chapter 35, the story of a cursed serving girl is told. After being hired by a duchess, the girl's clumsiness causes chaos in the kitchen, but her messes are secretly cleaned by fairy housekeepers, the Oich. As she gains the duchess's favor, she discovers that her curse, originating from a prince, can only be undone by him. The prince falls in love with her, and they marry, but the curse remains. At the wedding, the Oich reveal themselves and beat the girl until she transforms into a golden raven. The prince, now a raven himself, continues searching for her.